here because I want to show the entire video tonight, which it's not as long as some of them. So sometimes when they're 40 minutes or so, I try to cut them short so that we can have some time for discussion, but it's a little shorter than that tonight. So, but I will go ahead and tell you to begin. This is one of my favorites. I was watching it ahead of time, of course, and trying to review it. And he's got a lot of stories or illustrations in there that are kind of funny, the things he sometimes tells. At the same time, I think it's one of the most challenging in the same vein of what we've been saying all along. And very, very good way he presents it forth for us to think about and to be challenged with. So if you'll give your attention to that, then we will still have a few moments of discussion once it's over. Go ahead, Ethan.
You probably know what a rhetorical question is. A rhetorical question is one where a person asks for emphasis and not for information. When I was growing up, my father sometimes would say, "Son, do you want a spanking?" You know, he wasn't asking me if I really did that day want a spanking. He wasn't thinking that, this day I would say, "Dad, thank you so much for asking me that. I've really been feeling like my behavior needs some adjustment. And yes, today would be the day that I need a spanking." That's not what Dad was saying. What my dad was saying is, "Son, you are involving yourself in some behavior that you need to change. And if you don't change it, it's going to lead to you being punished. So do you want to be punished?" What's the rhetorical answer to that? No. So then change your behavior. There's a rhetorical question in the Bible as it relates to giving and stewardship and money. And the question is, will a man rob God? We find that question in Malachi chapter 3, and it's going to be in the middle of one of the most powerful biblical teachings on giving in the Bible. And so we're going to explore that idea. Will a man rob God? Why would God ask that question? Well, as we turn to the book of Malachi, Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament, and he's talking to a group of people that, well, frankly, they have just become greedy and covetous and stingy, and they aren't giving to God their best. They are bringing the lame and the maimed and animals that have diseases, and they're offering them to God. And God is tired of the way that they are treating the offering. And he comes to the text here and asks them that rhetorical question in verse 8, will a man rob God? Now, why is that a rhetorical question? The reason that's a rhetorical question is because it would make no sense to rob God. And here's why it wouldn't make any sense. If a person who is robbing a bank knows that the second that they step over the door threshold, that the bank owner is going to know exactly who they are, he's going to know exactly where they live, what they're driving, how they're going to attempt to get away with his money, and he's going to have everything at his disposal that he needs to capture them immediately. Does any bank robber say, "I'm going to rob a bank where I know I'm going to get caught, and I know I'm going to get captured, and I know I'm going to jail"? It just doesn't make any sense. And so God is talking to these Israelites, and he's asking them the simple question, will a man rob God? Well, the rhetorical answer to that is, no, you would never rob God. It just doesn't make sense. God knows exactly who you are. He knows exactly where you live. Doesn't matter what kind of mask you would try to put on to rob God. You can't get away with it. But then the text explains, yet you have robbed me, God says to the children of Israel. And they're wondering, and they respond in a way, and they say, notice the text, but you say, in what way have we robbed you? Has anybody ever accused you of robbing God, of stealing money from God? You know, if somebody did, if somebody said, "Hey, you've been robbing God, you've been stealing money from God," what would you say about that? You would probably be like these Israelites and say, "How?" You would probably think to yourself, well, I'm not taking money out of the collection plate. Well, at least I hope that you would be thinking that. You know, there have been some instances, and I know of a congregation where they said it was just pretty common knowledge that they would pass a plate to put money in, people would put money in, and it would come to this one particular person, and they would put a certain amount in, but they would get more in than they would get more out than they put in. They were literally taking money from the tray. Have you ever done that? Probably you're thinking, no, I've never done anything like that. These Israelites were probably thinking, I've never chipped any gold off of the temple, or I've never taken money from the box that was sitting in the back of the area where we give. They were probably thinking, I've never stolen any money from God. Several years ago, I remember John Smith coming to, I think it was Freed Hardeman when I was there, and he was talking about when he was a kid and this idea of robbing from God. And he said his dad would go in the summer to the little grocery store that was down the dirt road from his house. This was several decades ago. And he said he would walk around barefooted all summer long, and when his bare feet would hit that concrete of that grocery store floor, it would just be cool, and his dad would take a nickel and he would slap it down on the counter and say, give me a Nesbitt orange. And that was a kind of soda. And John Smith said he would watch as his dad drank this Nesbitt orange. And interestingly, never gave it to John Smith or any of his brothers or sisters. His dad went in there, bought this Nesbitt orange soda, and John Smith said he so wanted to go in and get a Nesbitt orange. But he said a nickel was kind of hard to come by back then, and he didn't have a nickel. And so he thought, where could he get a nickel? And it dawned on him that tray on Sundays, when they pass it, lots of times there was plenty of money in there, especially nickels. And so he said he was at a congregation that was a long building, and in the summer there was no air conditioning. And so after the service, everybody would go outside, and lots of times they would leave that tray in there. And he determined that the next Sunday he was going to get in there and get a nickel. And so he said everybody went out just like he had planned. And that next Sunday he came in and he took that nickel and pocketed it, and was so excited about that Monday morning going into the grocery store and slapping it on the counter, and in his deepest voice saying, give me a Nesbitt orange. He said, but as he slept that night, he didn't sleep easy, and he started thinking, maybe I hadn't done the right thing. Monday morning rolled around when he was supposed to go get his Nesbitt orange, and he thought, I just can't do that. Maybe I'll do it Tuesday. Tuesday rolled around, and he was thinking, I have done something terrible. Wednesday rolled around, and he was thinking, I hope I live till next Sunday to give this nickel back. And he was fearing that he was going to be in a car accident or he's going to die. I think he said Thursday or Friday evening he had a dream when he went to sleep. Said his preacher was a pretty big preacher, had a bald head, and when he would preach, his head would get red and he would sweat. And he said he was thinking about his preacher in his nightmare. And the preacher was up preaching, and he was explaining to the congregation that John Smith stole God's nickel. And John remembers just being terrified in that nightmare of the preacher pointing to him in the middle of his sermon, accusing him of stealing God's nickel. Well, when that Sunday rolled around, he waited till everybody else got out, and he ran up to the tray and he put that nickel in and said he had never felt so excited and so relieved in his life. But that's the idea we get where we're thinking, is a person going to steal from God? John Smith took one of God's nickels, but he put it back. Are you robbing from God? And I think most of us would say, no, we haven't stolen any money from the tray. We're not going into the craft room and taking reams and reams of paper to use it at our house. We're not stealing from God. And that was the perception of the Israelites. They didn't think they were stealing from God either. And God says, but yes, you are. And how many of them were being accused of stealing from God? He said, even this whole nation, he explains. Well, then he talks to them. He says that there in verse 9, but he in verse 8 says, here's how you're stealing from me. You're not chipping gold off the temple. You're not taking money out of the box. Notice what he says. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. Now, you've got to go back to our stewardship lesson to really get to the bottom of what he's saying here. If none of the money that we have is ours, and we're just stewards, and God entrusts us with a certain amount of money and says, I want at least 10% of that back, including free will offerings and leaving the corners of your fields, etc., to the Israelites. If that's what God was saying he wanted back, and they weren't giving it back to him, what were they doing? They were literally stealing it. Now, we talked about that idea of there's nowhere in the Bible that any person was ever called generous or a liberal giver or a scriptural giver who was giving less than 10% of their income. Not in the Old Testament, not in the New Testament. That's never been documented that God says a person is being a liberal, generous giver who's giving less than that. And so God says, if I entrust you with a certain amount of money and I ask for at least 10% of it back and you don't give it to me, then what are you doing? Well, then you're literally stealing it from me. You know, as you look at the stats in the United States of America, they're dismal when it comes to this idea of giving. When you ask people, do you believe the Bible teaches that you should give at least 10%? Depending on what particular survey that you find, but a bulk of people do, over 50%, about 55% say, yes, we believe that God says you should give at least 10% of your income. And now the next question is just simply, okay, do you do that? You know, of all people who call themselves Christians, only 9% are giving 10% of their income. That means 91% are giving less than that. What do you think God would say, according to what he says here in the book of Malachi, to a nation that is one of the most prosperous nations in the literal history of the world, that the average person in the United States has amenities like air conditioning and refrigerators that kings in the past couldn't have. And yet, on average, people in the United States of America who call themselves Christians are giving 2.5% of their income. You know, what's even more remarkable, I think, is that if you're making $75,000 or more, according to the surveys, only 1% of people who are making $75,000 or more are giving 10%. But if you're making $20,000 or less, 8% of them are giving 10% of their income. There's a 8 times better chance or 8 times more probable that a person making $20,000 is going to give 10% than someone making $75,000. And then even the more tragic result from these surveys that we find out is that some between 13 and 18% of people who call themselves born-again Christians are giving nothing. Do you think this still applies to people in today's society, that they're stealing from God because everything belongs to God? Haggai said in Haggai chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that the silver and the gold are mine. Psalm 50 says that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Do you think that people are not giving God back what he asked them to give, and they're stealing from God today? You know, we might need to change that question and ask the real simple question. Are you doing that? Are you stealing from God by not giving him back what he has asked for? Now that gets real sobering, doesn't it? Because if we were in an auditorium or a classroom setting or some type of group setting and someone said, oh, I found out you've been stealing from the IRS. They've been asking you for this amount of money. You have X number of back taxes. What would you immediately have to do? You'd, number one, start paying it back, or number two, if you don't, you'd be going to prison. If you were called in front of your boss at work and your boss found out you were skimming profits off of the top and you'd kept $50,000 last year that you didn't report, that you'd taken from the business, what would be the immediate reaction from your boss? Number one, you owe us 50 grand. And number two, we're going to press charges and you're going to prison. When we ask the question, have you been stealing from God? And God says that these Israelites have, and they say, well, we don't feel like we have. And God says, yeah, you have in tithes and offerings. You haven't been giving me back what I've asked you to give back. Then what? Well, then you're dealing with a situation here where these people were hit with the reality that what they thought didn't really matter that much. well, it becomes very serious. You know, oftentimes I see people who will talk about giving and stewardship, and they'll say, yeah, I see that. I see that God promises to bless the liberal, cheerful, generous giver. I see that God talks about giving and stewardship a whole lot. And I've just never really been able to make myself do that. I've been giving 2-3%, and I'm going to try to do better. I'm going to maybe start giving 4, start giving 5. I know he says we should probably, as you look at it, give at least 10%, but I'm going to work my way up to it. You know, how much sense does that make? If we find that we're in any other sin, if a person is getting caught in adultery, and they're committing adultery 3 times a month, and someone calls them on the carpet and says, you're committing adultery, and they say, yeah, you're right, 3 times a month, I'm going to cut back and I'm going to start only committing adultery twice this month. I'm going to hopefully get where I don't commit adultery at all, but I'm going to have to work through it slowly. Would anybody say anything like, oh, great, you're making real progress. I'm glad you're only committing adultery twice a month now. Just keep working on it. No, if you find out you're doing something that God asked you not to do that is a sin, what you need to do is change immediately. And when we looked at the curse of unscriptural giving and we looked at Haggai, well, they immediately changed their life right when they recognized what they needed to do. And so you look here and God says, you're stealing from God. They say, it doesn't look like it to us. He says in tithes and offerings. And then notice verse 10. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and prove me now in this, says the Lord of hosts. Now that text right there, he says, you're stealing from me. Here's the solution. Stop and start bringing in at least 10% of everything you ever make off of your fields, off of your livestock, everything, and test me. Well, what is the test? You know, in all the Bible, there's not another place where God says test him. He's saying, give me a shot to prove to you that I will do what I say I'm going to do. And so you look at the promise, you look at, okay, God, what do you want us to prove you in, to test you in? Here's what he says. And test me and prove me, says the Lord, if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessings that there will not be room enough to receive them. I've asked people this question a lot. It's a real simple question. Hey, do you want God to bless you? I've never had a person say, no, I'm about tired of blessings. I've had enough. You know, I feel like my health has been good. It probably needs to be worse. I probably need to have worse health. And I've had quite a bit of money and I'd like less. And, you know, financially, the prosperity, it's just, I just want to be blessed less. I want less emotional blessings. I want less spiritual blessings. I want less physical blessings. I wish God would bless me less. You ever met a person that would say that? I certainly haven't. And I don't think you would say that. If I were to say, do you want God to bless you? Answer, absolutely positive, I do. And I know that everybody that I've ever talked to does. Do you want God to bless you so much that you cannot handle it all? That you won't even know what to do with everything that God gives you? You know, now that is a remarkable statement. You mean to tell me that God is promising me that he will dump on me so many blessings that I don't even know how to handle them all if I do what? If I start giving scripturally and liberally and generously, and as he's talking to the Israelites, bringing in the tithe and the offerings here in the Old Testament, and we're under a better covenant with a better promise and a better sacrifice, and so 10% would be the floor, be the jumping off place for us in the New Testament. We understand there are only 3 times in the New Testament where God ever talks about a percent, really in a lot of ways, and that's number 1, the rich young ruler who he says give all of it. Zacchaeus gives 50% of everything he has, and the woman who gives her 2 mites gives 100%. So the idea that somehow New Testament Christians could get away with giving less and receive God's blessing and promise, I just don't think anybody could reason in that fashion correctly. So here's the question. Do you want God to bless you more than you can possibly even handle? Yes, that's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes, we all do. Then what? Then start giving to God scripturally. You know, you sometimes see a person that just doesn't believe what God is saying. And that's what you'd have to come to this text and really do if you didn't want to be blessed more. You would have to say, no, I just don't think God will do that. I'm not going to give scripturally. I'm not going to give in a generous way because I just don't think God will really bless me more than I can handle, like He's promising to in Malachi chapter 3. You mean to tell me you don't believe God keeps His word? God always keeps His word. He's always kept His word about every single thing that He's ever said. When God said that He was going to send the Messiah and He was going to be born of a virgin, He was going to be born in Bethlehem, and that Messiah was going to take on the sins of the whole world, and He was going to die and come back from the grave 3 days later, and then He was going to, after that resurrection, ascend into heaven, and His kingdom was going to be started there in the New Testament, and anybody who follows His plan of salvation can be added to the kingdom. God has fulfilled every promise He's ever made, and that's what He's saying. I don't break promises. You know, imagine if a preacher or a person, maybe even at your business or something, stood up and said, hey, I'm trying to get you to understand this idea of generosity as the Bible teaches it and the scriptural approach to it. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Now, this is hypothetical, but just think with me. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to promise all of you. I'm going to commit to this statement. If you will come up to me afterward and shake my hand, I will give you a $100 bill. So after I get done, I want you guys to understand what I'm trying to say here. I want you to test me. I want you to prove me. I want you to see if you will do it or not. You come up to me, shake my hand. You don't even have to tell me good lesson, good sermon, good speech. You don't have to say anything. Just shake my hand. I'll give you $100. Now imagine a preacher, he stands up and he makes that statement, like I said, hypothetical, but afterward there are a few people who think, yeah, I'll try that. And so they come up and they shake the preacher's hand. He gives them $100. They are thrilled with that, and they start walking out the auditorium. And as they walk out the auditorium, they're looking at their crisp, clean $100 bill. And some people who were sitting in the back, they decided it was too far to walk up front. They didn't go up and shake the preacher's hand. They said, hey, where'd you get that $100 bill? These people said, well, you heard what the preacher said. If you walk up and shake his hand, he'll give you $100. I walked up, I shook his hand, he gave me $100. They said, no way. Yeah, I did. And so some of those people come up to the preacher and they shake his hand, they get $100. And they're thrilled with it, and they walk out. And there are some other people in the congregation that heard this lesson, and they just thought, no, that's ridiculous. Nobody's going to give me $100 just for shaking their hand. That is not going to happen. And these people walk by them, and they're all carrying their $100. And the people who were the naysayers say, where'd you get that $100? And people who are asked, they walked up and shook the preacher's hand, gave me $100. You can do it. He said, just test him. And some people still walk away from that saying, well, that preacher probably doesn't even have $100 left. Oh, he's probably giving it to too many people. All that. Regardless of what the excuse is, if you don't walk up and get the $100, then whose fault is it that you didn't do that? It's yours. That you were made a promise, a commitment, and the way to get the result of that commitment is if you do that. So you have God saying, test me, just try me, and see if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and dump on you so many blessings that you won't be able to control them all. You won't be able to handle them all. You won't even know what to do with them all. I've seen that in so many people's lives. You know, it's interesting to me that the people who love to hear lessons on giving are the people who are already giving. They're the ones who have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. They're the ones who have tried God, who have proved God, and God has blessed them over and over and over. Spiritually, emotionally, physically, financially, they have just continued to get the blessings that God has promised them. I was talking to one of my friends about giving, and he was saying, yeah, you know, you just can't outgive God. There's just no way to get to a point where you have given more than God will respond with. And we'll look at the ideas of sowing and reaping more, and how you reap what you sow. You reap more than you sow. You reap after you sow, things like that. But as you look at this idea that God gives you so many blessings that you don't even know what to do with them all. This particular friend of mine was talking about how, he had a Jeep that was worth about $10,000, and he was thinking about getting rid of it to give to a missionary. He loved the Jeep, and he had a son that was coming up that might be driving it, but he thought, you know what, I think I'll go ahead and sell this. There's a missionary that I know that's going overseas, and he's going to need some money. Now, he was telling me this in confidence and making sure I didn't tell anybody his name or whatever, but he said, that principle of getting blessed in a way that you can't even do things with all of it. He said, I thought I was really sacrificing. I thought it was really a big sacrifice. I had bought that Jeep, and $10,000 is a lot of money. He said, and so I sold that Jeep and I gave it to the missionary. And 3 weeks later, I had that $10,000 back in my hand from an avenue that I never would have expected. And now I had another $10,000 that I needed to find something else to do with. I used to listen to VP Black preach on this, and he said, when God promises that he'll bless you with more blessings than you can handle, what does that look like? What does it mean? He said, I don't know what it'll look like in your life. He said, for me, on any number of occasions, I've been in a place where I've been working with a congregation and they've been paying me a good salary, and I'll have another congregation that would come over and say, Brother VP, we would love for you to come preach at this congregation and we'll pay you this much. And he said, I love my congregation here, and this congregation over here was willing to pay me even more than I was making over here. He said, lots of times I wouldn't take those jobs, but I could have, and I could have made more money. And I was being approached with so many blessings, I didn't even know what to do with them all. I couldn't even handle all of the options and the blessings that I had been given. I was hearing from a friend that was talking about just his investments and how he and his wife had committed to really sacrificially giving this year, and they said, okay, we're going to set this point, and this certain point was, I think it was $50,000 for their family at that time, and they were going to try to give $50,000. And they accomplished their goal. But they said at the end of that, when they gave that $50,000 and looked back at what had happened to them that year, their investments had gone up 50%. And they had received more in their investment income than the money that they had given. And that was, it's just an example of you can't outgive God. Now, sometimes it might not be in a financial immediate ratio of, you give 50,000, God gives back 50,000. But God promises. He says, you test me and see if your life is not better in every category, if you will be a scriptural liberal giver. And I'm telling you, you don't need me to stand here and tell you that's true. God says, test him. Has God ever broken a promise? No, he never will. I remember years ago, have it on video, there's a grandfather who is playing catch with his grandson. Now, when I say playing catch, they were in a room and there was a couch there in the room, and the little grandson, he was probably about 2 or so, 2.5, and he would climb up on that couch, and the grandfather was sitting in the floor, and he was putting his hands out, and the grandson would jump into his arms. And so the grandfather's catching him, and the grandson is just cracking up, giggling, laughing, having a great time. Well, the grandfather puts his arms up, and somebody gets his attention, and he turns over here to look. But the grandson doesn't see that he's turned over to look, and the grandson jumps, and the grandfather's not prepared, and he doesn't catch his grandson. His grandson falls and hits his head on the floor. He doesn't hit it hard, but just enough to make him cry a little bit. And so the granddad whips around and he sees his grandson there on the floor, and he picks him up and hugs him and makes sure he's okay and he's not hurt bad at all. And so he puts him back up on the couch and asks him to jump again. Well, what do you think that grandson's going to do? He shook his head like, no, I'm not jumping again. You dropped me. I think a lot of people are looking at God with his arms outstretched saying, jump, I'll catch you. I never drop people. And they're thinking, God won't catch me. God has never dropped anyone. Prove me now in this, he says. Test me and see if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour on you so many blessings that you will not even be able to contain them all. Do you want that kind of blessing? We all do. Let's be honest. then the way to do that, the way to take God at His word, to test Him, is to become liberal, generous givers and let God do the blessing.
That, and we've got about 15 minutes left or so here that we can take any questions or comments, but I found that one to be one of the ones that really hits home in several different ways that causes us to think about the promises of God in particular. Whether it's the story at the end, because if you have your book and you've read the chapter, maybe you looked ahead to this chapter, he tells that story at the end. We're in chapter 8, God's Dare, and he says that, when he writes it, he says there was not a bone broken, there was not a lamp broken, but what was broken was the trust from that grandfather, right, of that little grandson. And so it's kind of challenging to think about that. And I love the title of this lesson, which is God's Dare. God's Dare. And it's the idea that really this lesson starts with scary information. It's he used the word sobering. It's very serious. It's very difficult about this idea of, are you robbing God? I mean, something that's actually, unimaginable, as he said, almost impossible, because you can't, steal from someone who knows everything in a sense, but are you robbing God? Very sort of challenging, step on your toes, ask you to think, are you wrong in this? But I love in this particular lesson how it completely turns around in the end, and that God's dare is really that if you will do as He is asking you to do, instructing us to do, then it doesn't have to be scary, it doesn't have to be sobering, it doesn't have to be that big of a step on your toes moment, but it's meant to be happy. It's meant to be joyous. It's meant to allow us to continue to be reminded about the blessings of God and how He blesses us. And that translates into everything. When it comes to His salvation, or our salvation, the way He has blessed us through salvation, to know that when He didn't break His promise to Moses, when He didn't break His promise to Noah, He didn't break His promise to anyone or anybody between now and the beginning of the earth, as we go back and read throughout history, He's not going to break His promise to us. And we know that He won't break His promise when He talks about saving us and He talks about heaven. So it's a wonderful challenge to think about God's dare. In fact, the couple of stories he told there at the end, the idea that there are people who are saying, I'm trying to sacrifice. He gives so much it hurts. That's been used a time or two. I'm trying to make it hurt. I'm trying to give so much that it's a challenge to me and my family. But so many people have stories where every time I try, then I just find myself blessed and happy and better off because I have tried, because I have been giving. And I was thankful because I have taught this material before. I've mentioned that, and I don't always remember where things were, but it was this video where he says himself, it's not always an exact financial ratio. It's not always an exact dollar for dollar, even though he sometimes uses those kinds of stories. It's not always that way. I'm sure that family that gave or wanted to commit to giving $50,000, and he said in that story that they didn't find out till later in the year, maybe when they were doing their taxes the next year, that their investments had cleared that hurdle. And so maybe they didn't know for a while. Maybe it did hurt. And they realized, man, we're doing a good thing. We're doing what we committed to do. But things are, maybe a little more challenging, or we're having to really think about things. But in the end, it did. It came back and it blessed them so much. What promise has God forgotten? What promise has God not kept? And of course, the answer is there's none that He hasn't kept. There's none that He has forgotten. And we need to think about that when it comes to this as well. I did want to set one record straight. I don't have any $100 bills to hand out tonight. So if y'all all come up and shake my hand, I'm sorry. That was not my illustration. But I do appreciate that. And what's challenging about that is that's really what was crazy was I was thinking, how ridiculous does that story sound? Right? How ridiculous that there were people in the back who went ahead and stepped outside and said, he didn't mean what he said. Then people are coming out with $100 bills, and what are they still saying? He didn't mean what he said. Well, it's too far to the front. I don't want to walk all the way from the back, the front auditorium. I'm hungry. I've got to go eat. How ridiculous. But how true that is for so many of us in so many things. I don't even talk about just giving in that way. How many times do we test God in sort of a negative sense because we say, oh, he doesn't really mean that I have to do that. He doesn't really want me to do that. He hasn't really said that this will be the case. And it's certainly true with this giving principle and our stewardship, but with a lot of things. Just such a simple story that sounds so ridiculous to us, but yet really is part of the human condition and the way that we react to God sometimes. We'll find every excuse To say, well, I can't go from that part of the auditorium to that part of the auditorium. It's too much. It's too long. I don't have time. I'm too hungry. Whatever it might be, to receive something so simple. And the same is true for so many people with a lot of things from God's Word. What comments or questions do you have there about anything in the video or anything from this lesson if you read ahead or studied it?
I think it's just another example, just like if you got a good prayer life, if you got a good Bible study life,
Yeah.
if you got a good commitment to coming to worship services, then you're going to be blessed. And people, I feel like there's been times in my life I didn't.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I had the blessings. And it's not financial blessings, it's just blessings in my life. It might have been financial, I don't know.
Sure.
But just being blessed because you're trying to do what God wants you to do.
Yeah, you found the examples I was looking for. I couldn't quite get those out, but that's exactly right. Reading, praying, those kinds of things. Let's take reading, for example. Something we've asked you to do, we're trying to challenge each other to do. That's one of those. I don't have time. I got too much going on. I'm too tired. I'm too hungry. In the morning, I've got to get out the door, all those things. But when you do stop and read, you find that you are very blessed from that. It might be, and when we talk about a one-for-one kind of thing or something like that, it might be that if you're reading through the New Testament, somebody at work might ask you a question that you not really considered until you read Acts chapter 10 or 1 Corinthians chapter 5 or whatever. And maybe you read that morning. Is that, Patrick's here tonight, so I can talk about providence again. But, is that providence? I don't know. That's kind of the answer to providence. We can't always understand in the moment. But if I open up to 1 Corinthians 5 and I happen to read that morning as part of my Bible reading, and then later in the day at work, somebody asked me a bit of a difficult question, but I was like, I was just reading about that. It's funny how that works sometimes. When we feel blessed, when we simply do what God has asked us to do, being committed to Him in a lot of different ways. And so that's absolutely a very good point there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the moment it's tough. Does somebody else raise their hand? No, it's tough in the moment, but yeah, we can look back at it later. Sue? Mm-hmm.
We get to the services and the preacher preaches about it.
Yeah.
So we're blessed.
Yeah. All these things that kind of happen, and they really are probably a way in which God has blessed us. Now, we struggle with that. Back to Patrick's questions several weeks ago, but we struggle sometimes with how to categorize that or say that. There are a lot of people in the denominational world and around the world say, well, God, caused that to happen, and we, kind of struggle with that, and what's providence, what's not providence. That's a whole different discussion, but as we're pointing out, there are always things that we look back and we say, man, I was blessed by something happening because I was trying to do what's right. Is there another hand I saw? Somebody? No? I also wanted to say that I think, Kyle talked about in that story of John Smith stealing the nickel, that he visioned the preacher's face in his dream. So I don't hope you hear my voice at night when you go lay down, and maybe you hear Kyle's voice and all that. But that's why I joke about letting him do it through this. But I want to say too, and we still have a few minutes left if anybody thinks of anything, but I understand, and I try to stand here and as honestly as I can say to you almost every time, and really anytime I stand up here in front of you, that I realize that we are all, as we look across this room, and there are anywhere between 50 to 100 of us at any given time, at different points in life. There are some people in this room who are struggling to figure out how they're going to make a payment or to pay some bills. There's some people who are trying to struggle with how they're going to make some decisions in life. We're all struggling through many different things and many different situations. Sometimes that's financially, sometimes it's not. And so it's real easy to sometimes stand up here, even as Kyle makes it seem so simple in the video, and say, hey, this is it. You just got to do it. Take it or leave it. It's so easy. And I know that it's not always easy when we're struggling with life and different things. But what he is saying is certainly still true. He is asking you, we are trying together as a congregation to open God's Word and see if it's true and understand what God says about it. But I hope that as we have now been we're halfway through this particular series, that even if you felt challenged, that you'll never shut it off and say, well, that's too hard, that's too far. I don't like that he's talking about me or something like that kind of internally. I hope that you will continue to try to stay open to all of this and considering how you can improve. Now, he kind of had the funny story there of the idea of, I'm going to commit adultery just a few times less this month. And it's kind of a facetious story, but I will say that I do see to an extent how we have work to do sometimes. And it doesn't always just happen overnight. Maybe we found ourselves in some kind of situations where we've got some work to do to get out from under that, maybe financially, again, in particular. In fact, one of the things I thought of when I was watching the video tonight, and I hadn't thought before, I wrote it down, but he had the statistics from just these studies. And so he always mentions, born-again Christians. They're kind of open studies for people who claim to be born-again Christians. But one of the stats he mentioned was that only 1% of those making $75,000 or more. So again, I don't need your reaction. We don't need any show of hands. But when you hear that number, that registers something to you, right? Either you've been under that, you've been above that, you're right at that, but that number means something to you to some extent. But of those who make $75,000, I think it was, or more maybe, only 1% of that gives 10%. So you know what that says to me? Is that when we get more, we usually probably accrue more debt and we do more with it, right? I mean, we find other ways to spend it. It's kind of the American way. I'll just be real honest about it, right? I don't have time tonight to get into the history of credit cards and banks and all that, but I mean, there are people who've made lots of money over the years off of people's willingness to go further and further in debt. Not to, I don't know if it was Sue or Tina or somebody, or Robert or Linda one night talked about, having a budget and saying this is how much we bring in, and like a zero budget, they call it. We're not going to spend over that. But whatever the time frame was or whatever, this country began to change with this idea of you can have as much as you want. This promise of you can have this many credit cards, this line of credit, have as much as you want. You just keep accruing and accruing and have whatever. And so that's kind of the challenge, is that sometimes as our income goes up in our society and in our country, and we are absolutely influenced by that, all of us, myself included, then it becomes, well, how can I, find ways to spend that and have more and buy something else? And I don't have to pay for it all. I can, take payments on it. And so that's where that comes in, I think, just a little bit. And so, again, while I do understand his principle, and I think it makes sense with the example of not just cutting back, but trying to stop cold turkey, as we say, and do better, I also understand that sometimes as we struggle in this life, we have to make decisions and try to change. And sometimes it may take a little while to really get around to what we should be doing. But we certainly should commit to that in the same way we should with anything else we talked about, prayer, Bible study, or any of those things. A couple minutes left. Any other comments or questions here? We won't ask you to show your hand if you've taken from the tray when it's gone around or may change in the tray, right? It's kind of always a joke. I told you I really enjoyed this because it was full of a lot of those kind of funny stories that we talk about, or you think. He told the one a couple of weeks ago about the people who were counting the money and just taking it. Just taking some off each week, each Sunday before they turned in the number. You'd be surprised what money will cause us to do. Maybe you would be surprised, because a lot of us have been there where we're struggling, and we're not necessarily just going to rob a bank. We're trying to do anything we can think of to help get through this particular struggle. Again, God's dare is, try me, test me. Do you want God to bless you? He said. And that facetious, he had several lines. Nope, I'm good. I don't want any more. I've had too much. It's, again, kind of how ridiculous, how silly, but how often we feel that way. Or, as he said towards the beginning, how often do we act that way? When you ask the question, are you robbing God? It's what you can say that's part of the answer, but it's really what you show and your actions that are part of the answer too. And back to, as we've talked about, Ricky, and other things, that's what it is with everything. You can say you love God, and it's almost back to this idea we talked on Sunday morning about grace and works. Which is it? Well, it's kind of a little bit of both in a way. You can say all day that you love God, but what are you doing? Is it only about doing and only about checking the box? No, but your actions are going to show something. We said in the very beginning, look at your pocketbook, look at your bank account, look at your outgoing, look at your calendar, look at your time, and you'll be able to tell, how much you love God to an extent, to a point, and where you're spending your time and effort and your money and all of this. So God's dare is great, but it's not meant to be scary, and it's not meant to be something that really is sobering in that way, but it's meant to be encouraging for us. Next week, lesson 9 is proof of your love. And so we will plan to pick up there then with lesson 9 if you want to be looking ahead at that. So appreciate your good attention tonight.